people believe that faith and science are mutually exclusive
Right.
endeavors. Now, as
Hmm.
someone whose work crosses both of those fields, I'm speaking about yourself.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I disagree. I mean, when you look at the nature of faith and the nature of science, at the core of both of them is truth. And the exploration of truth is to uplift the human person. John Paul II has a beautiful encyclical entitled Fides et Ratio, and that's Latin for faith and reason. And the very first line of Fides et Ratio is that faith and reason are the two wings of which the human person ascends. And so, therefore, if we understand the relationship properly, being that science limits itself to the study of the observables, the study of the material, the study of those things we can measure, those things that we can understand in terms of the material world, there's no conflict. And if anything, that the church should be emphasizing, we need to develop our reason. We need to explore science on its own terms, not in terms of what sometimes very sincere Christians, but unfortunately, in my opinion, some Christians that don't have a terribly healthy understanding of how to do this, they try to either fit science into the scriptures or they try to fit scripture into science. And both of that just creates an intellectual mess. You end up reinventing errors that the church has had um, committed for centuries, such as making God one being within creation. If you want to try to have a clear, trying to fit scripture inside of a scientific metaphor, in terms of a scientific structure. When we look at God, God is not a being in creation, but being itself. God is beyond time. God is not conditioned to time. And so, therefore, when you understand the true relationship between the nature of faith and the nature of science, they're really a complement to each other and is necessary for the person to embrace to grow in knowledge. And so, therefore, a Catholic Christian um, should have no fear of studying science on its own terms because science is an exploration of truth. Faith is an exploration of truth. And if you are exploring the truth, you are ultimately seeking after the source of that truth. And from my Catholic tradition, that we clearly see that that leads us to the origin of our understanding of God as the source of all truth. So there's a lot more that could be said, but that's a little bit of a Reader's Digest answer to your question.
Father James, you mentioned eternity a few times in
Yes.
the in
Mm-hmm.
this last segment. Now, in cosmology, and many of our Slooh members controlling the giant Slooh telescopes, of course, are fascinated with the
Yeah.
larger issues of the universe, including where does it end, how does it extend, and in recent years, there's been some data, such as the Berkeley team in 2013, indicating that the flat topology of space may indicate that space goes on and on and on, and
Mm-hmm.
that it's infinite, and
Mm-hmm.
that going in the other direction with the Big Bang, we certainly don't know what preceded that, but there are some suggestions that the universe may be eternal. That's the word you
Mm-hmm.
used. Now, is an eternal universe or one that's infinite in extent, certainly it's beyond what our minds can grasp, is this
Mm-hmm.
compatible or incompatible with church doctrine?
Very good question. And correct me if I'm wrong, because this is where perhaps some of my deficiencies in science may show up. So at any time, Bob, you feel you need to correct me on any of this, feel free to jump in. But from my standpoint is that when we look at the created world, we see time as a dimension. And so therefore, when we understand in a scientific sense, the understanding of something that goes on forever, something that goes on infinitely, it's still within the context of a world of time, of which that dimension is present. When we speak of the infinite in the divine in terms of God, we see an existence that is not conditioned by time, that is not conditioned by any of the material dimensions of the world. And so therefore there is a difference in terms of, if to borrow a little bit of Wittgenstein, that it's not necessarily the term you use, but what's the definition underneath the term that's being used. When we understand the idea of an infinite God, it's not that there is a divine clock that goes on in heaven that can measure in a never ending heaven. It's the idea that when you are in that realm of God, there is no time. There, time does not exist. That
Yeah, well, that's very nice. That
dimension.
is actually compatible with the way science has been going. More and more
Mhm,
scientists are increasingly leaning toward time just being something that we humans create to make sense of things. Unlike Newton, who thought it
mhm,
was an actual dimension, more and
mhm,
more people are like Immanuel Kant, who think that it's like our numbering system. It's
mhm,
not something that's real, like a cucumber. It's nothing
mhm,
you can examine, and therefore, you certainly couldn't travel through it, and it doesn't have independent existence by itself.
mhm.
So what you're saying is actually more and more in keeping with the way science is going, that there really
Yeah.
is no time in reality, and the underlying reality anyway.
Mhm. Yeah, and and thank you for that correction. I appreciate that because one of the things in theology we're always careful to distinguish is to emphasize that one of the things that I oftentimes see people who are trying to critique faith from a scientific standpoint, a mistake that I see them to make is that it eventually tries to make God one being within creation. And to constantly go back to that understanding that God is not a being. And it's something that is very hard for the human mind to grasp, of thinking of something, an entity that's not a being itself. And so I appreciate your correction, in terms of the understanding of time. So thank you for that.
No, that's in keeping with the line of passive understanding, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
what we're talking about really does passive our human symbolic language, where we have words for
Mm,
things. I mean, actual water is not the word water. So we try to understand things with our symbolic representative language, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that there's an underlying reality that's beyond what we can even think. I
yeah,
think
it's
of
interesting
this.
you say that. A former classmate of mine from seminary, Father John Carchi, was just named rector of Mundelein Seminary, and he was an astrophysicist. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. And for me at that time, being that I was just an infant at that point of trying to understand intellectually this relationship between faith and science, I had a conversation with him, being that here's an interesting guy. He's an astrophysicist, but also studying to be a priest. How do those two work for him? And precisely to your point, when I was all curious about, how does he see this all fit together? One of the things he shared with me in reflection was he's like, James, one thing you have to remember is that it's not faith in the biblical sense, but there is an underlying faith that an astrophysicist has, that the numbers, the symbols, the expressions that are being used actually work the way you think that they're working. And speaking precisely to what you talk about is that we have these realities that we give names to, such as water. But at the same time, there's also that exploration of human reason and refinement of human reason that has contributed to that language and will change the language in the future, and will refine it even further and give us a better understanding of the natural world. And in that process, we'll also be able to get a better understanding of the divine and of God, in terms of, as we better know how the universe works and how the world works, it gives us a deeper sense of our understanding of the source of that universe and how
Ah,
that source relates with us.
fascinating. We've been speaking with Father James of the Vatican Observatory. We're doing this here at Slooh because this is the day of the lunar eclipse that's uniting many, many people in the
Mhm.
world, looking at an event that the moon and the earth are both intimately involved in. And so, of course, here we are all together, very much concerned with our planet Earth and the issues that extend beyond it. So, this was a fascinating discussion. We're really in your debt for you joining us here today. Thank you. And perhaps we'll speak to you again in the future. We appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you for everything you do. I'm a Slooh member, and I remember just watching your little clips that you have when I would schedule time on one of the telescopes in the Canary Islands or in Chile. Just listening to your 5 or 10 minute explanations of these objects really helped me understand the universe and nebulas and stars. And so thank you for everything that you do. And on behalf of the Vatican Observatory and the Vatican Observatory Foundation, I just thank you for inviting me on. I deeply appreciate being a guest on your show today.